Hi, welcome back. This is our third and final installment for the lectures for Assignment 1, the May 5th readings, the Mark Blyth readings. If you remember in Lecture 1, the focus was on Mark Blyth's first capitalist computer, the capitalist computer that governed the era of the Great Compression from 1945 to 1980. Lecture 2 mainly focused on the neoliberal capitalist computer that governed economies throughout the industrialized world from 1980 to about 2008. At the end of the last lecture, I talked about the bug in this computer that has led to what Blyth describes as an era of neo-nationalism. So his idea is that the first computer had a bug that then led to a reset and the implementation of this new computer, the neoliberal computer. And now the bug in this neoliberal computer is now leading to something new. And we're in a position, we're in a transitional period, we're looking for a reset. Now, I want to say a little bit more in this third lecture about how the bug in the neoliberal computer leads to what is commonly described as populism. And I want to say a little bit about what populism is. And then I want to relate all this material back to the main themes of the course that have to do with the human tendency, the human possibility to exist in relations of domination and the countervailing human tendency, our ability, capacity to exist in relations that are more egalitarian. I'll get to that at the very end. But let's go back and just talk about this nexus from the bug in the neoliberal computer to the generation of populism. To get into this, to get to the meat of what at least someone like Blyth thinks populism is about, a way to think about populism. Let's back up to this 2007-2008 banking crisis that is supposed to have taken us out of the neoliberal era from Blyth's perspective to this new era where we're slowly working our way to something that is no longer this neoliberal era. So in 2000, so there's this big financial crisis in 2002 and 2008, and it began with a massive sudden depreciation in what's called the subprime mortgage market, and mainly in the United States. But this is actually throughout the world. This market. Let me use some concepts from last lecture to help describe this crisis. Remember from the last lecture that the era of neoliberalism has bred a kind of stagnation in consumer demand because there's a stagnation in wages. Folks don't have money, and they're also up to the eyeballs in consumer debt. Then they just aren't able to buy as much stuff. And if there isn't much, if consumers at large, the public at large, doesn't have the means to buy as much a bunch of stuff, then what that's going to do is it's going to create a sluggish investment environment. This will make for a sluggish economy with few profitable investment opportunities. So then, what are creditors, or prospective creditors? What are folks with a lot of money who want to get good returns on their money going to do if they can't invest in these opportunities in this kind of real economy of ordinary folks? What they're going to do is they're going to make increasingly risky loans in the hopes of getting decent returns on their investment. They're going to just keep chasing that high return on investment. The subprime mortgage market was one giant set of risky loans made by investors chasing better returns than those they got in the stagnant neoliberal economy. Let me explain this just a bit. This subprime mortgage market. So think of a mortgage on a house. For the owner of the house, that mortgage is a liability. It's something that you have to pay every month, and you're paying on this principal amount that you've borrowed plus interest on that amount every month. Now, what's important to keep in mind is for the bank, your liability is an asset. That is, it's a money flow for them. It's a guaranteed money flow from them, for them, that runs the length of the loan. So it's because what you've promised to do is to pay them back a monthly amount on the principal plus some interest, and that's where they're making some money, or they can in a low inflation environment anyway, which is what you've had in the neoliberal era. All right. So so your loan, any loan you make, is an asset for the person on the other side of this loan, the lender. Now, what the financial sector does, one of the things that it does is it can bundle thousands and thousands of mortgages or whatever loan into these big packages, these securities. Like it's a whole bundle of loans that one bank can then sell to another bank on an open market. Now, what you had in this neoliberal era is that you had a whole bunch of mortgage lenders chasing risky loans, trying to get that good return on investment, and more willing to make these risky loans, trying to get this return on investment that's really hard to get in this stagnant economy. And as a result, they made a whole bunch of risky loans, and then they bundled them together and sold them on these markets. Now, this all comes to a head with the collapse in this market. For whatever reason, Keynes uses this term animal spirits. The animal spirits all of a sudden woke up and realized, whoa, these massive packages of risky loans, they are not very reliable. We really shouldn't be buying them. They're too risky for us to hold. Everyone starts to have that sort of thought. That market collapses. And what that does is it all of a sudden puts a whole bunch of really large banking actors in a squeeze, because what they thought was asset value that had this market value, say, of 100, now all of a sudden has a market value that's like 10% of that. It collapses. And these large banks are at dire risk of going under. And if a whole bunch of large banks, a whole bunch of large lending facilities throughout the world go under, then there's going to be no one to make loans to kind of keep the economy going. Okay. Now, there's one bank in particular that's sort of emblematic for this period. It's one that actually went under. It's Lehman Brothers. It collapsed. So the collapse of Lehman Brothers, the collapse of this market in general, just sends shockwaves throughout the global economy. Now, in response to this, in order to stave off like a systemic collapse in credit markets throughout the world, and then something that's going to look a lot like the Great Depression back in the 30s, the U.S. Federal Reserve and other central banks throughout the world just intervened massively into the economy. Now, last time we talked about central banks, like one of the main things they do is they're able to set the baseline interest rate in economies. But another big thing that they've been able to do, and they've really made this part of their toolkit, particularly since 2008, is that they are able to create government debt, government bonds, like a promise, an IOU by some sovereign government, like the U.S., to pay back a bond that's basically an IOU that says, look, I'm going to pay you back $100 for the $100 you give me now, plus some interest rate that they set. So the Federal Reserves are able to just generate a whole bunch of these IOUs, and they're able to, what they do is they use these IOUs to go purchase all these distressed packages of loans. So they basically give a lot of companies, other than Lehman Brothers, they let just go to hell, but a bunch of other banking facilities, they basically swapped out government IOUs for the junk debt, the junk bundles of loans that they had. And then these banks that were going to collapse now have real solid, rock solid sovereign debt that they're able to sell on the market and just recapitalize. And this was the tool that by which these central banks sort of propped up and sustained and saved the financial system to protect the economy, the global economy as a whole, and to stave off something like a Great Depression. Now, but anyway, so this is what sometimes you might, if anyone, in my audience here that, reads business news or, just pays attention to these kinds of things, this is the infamous corporate bailout of this time period, where basically the government comes in and just bails out all these large banks. Now, one thing to kind of just pause or to bring to the fore for the purposes of our present discussion of populism is to think for a second how perverse this is, this whole arrangement. So governments throughout the world bailed out the financial sector, these holders of these super risky loans, in fact, these banks that were chasing these returns that they weren't able to get in the stagnant economy. So the government bails them out, gives good sovereign debt in exchange for this risky junk debt. And now, except for Lehman Brothers, these banking facilities throughout the world, they didn't fail. In fact, the people at the commanding heights of this financial sector, they maintained their levels of wealth and income, and then some. After 2008, things really started taking off. Okay, so you have this whole crisis, and the folks that are kind of at the heart of it and responsible for it, they get off scot-free, and in fact, their incomes get better. Now, on top of that, think of what happens when the governments use their own debt to bail out these corporate sectors. Basically, they've converted all this risky junk private corporate debt to public debt. And now governments have this much, much larger debt burden than they had before, which makes them even more resistant than they have been to spend on, infrastructure. Things like healthcare and schools and roads. These kinds of injections into the economy is something that in the neoliberal era they've already been resistant to doing, but now they've massively increased government debt levels, so they're even more resistant. So you have a government that just bails out this corporate sector. They're even more austere. They're practicing a kind of austerity. They're forced to practice kind of austerity, not injecting money into the economy by spending on infrastructure. We've had 40 years or so of stagnant wages. This bailout doesn't help with that at all. We also have conspicuous growing inequalities in the system during this entire time period. This whole thing is a toxic brew. Voters are, 80 or 90% of folks are in these precarious economic situations. And a lot of them are very anxious about this. Like we described last time, they have this rolling debt. They keep taking on debt that they keep rolling over to just take care of their basic needs. They're having to pay a lot of money for these big ticket items with decreasing subsidies from the federal governments to help them with, such as with education or and in the United States, healthcare. Prices of big ticket items like homes are going way up. This is a very anxious state, the economic state for many, many folks. So you've got that. You've got corporate bailout. You've got conspicuous inequalities and growing inequalities in the system. This is a toxic brew. Voters are primed for a change agent. They're primed to find something other than the center-left and center-right parties that they associate with their current economic straits. In short, and now here we're finally coming back to populism, our topic, in short, voters are in a populist mood, where we might describe populism as a sentiment that the government is no longer sensitive to the needs of the public. So a widespread sentiment like that, and this is coupled with a sentiment that the current elites, the current establishment, needs to be thrown out so that the public can exert control of the system in service of its unmet needs. This has manifested itself, according to Blyth, in what he calls global Trumpism. This is what Brexit was about. This is voters voting for something different in the current political economic system. This is what Boris Johnson, who doesn't really look like, your grandfather's Tories. This is Trump, who definitely doesn't look like your grandfather's Republicans. This economic anxiety, this populism driven by this economic anxiety, has put people in a position where they're willing to vote for someone who looks very different, even though they even look a little crazy from what's gone before, because what's gone before has put them in a really difficult economic situation. Something that is worth pondering here, given that we are a Canadian university and we're all Canadians, is whether this kind of populist Trumpism has come to Canada at all. And you might ask, you might apply this question to Doug Ford. You might ask, well, what kind of Tory is he? Is he different in the way that Boris Johnson is different from center-right establishment Tories of the past? Or is he something other than that? But anyway, he's an interesting phenomenon. Someone might argue that he fits within this kind of populist movement that's been going through across the world. Now, something that I'll mention too that's relevant to our particular place in time at the moment. Right now, in the time of COVID, we have an economy that's collapsing. Social distancing makes it really hard for folks in all kinds of sectors of the economy to make any money. We're seeing and we're hemorrhaging employees, or unemployment is going way up. Some economists think that we might hit 20 or 30% unemployment by the time, as this thing continues on. So the economy is on life support right now, and Federal Reserves are using this new arrow in their quiver that they really developed in 2008. These central banks are now just pouring money into the economy using the same vehicle, which is they're taking government bonds and they're backing all kinds of things in the corporate sector with these government bonds. They're recapitalizing the corporate sector with these government bonds, and they're doing this throughout the economy. Now, one thing you might ask is whether one way to sort of measure what's going on in terms of the themes of the course, inequality, domination, what have you, you might look at these different responses in different countries to see, to the extent to which the central bank driven response is something that is widely distributed in service of the interests of people throughout the population, or whether it really attends in particular to the needs of just some of the economy, as is what seems to have happened of some sectors of the economy is, like what seems to have happened back in 2008. Anyway, let's get back to the key topic. So Blyth's thought is that in 2008, with the collapse of Lehman and these financial markets and then the bailout, the neoliberal system had kind of run its course. The bug in its computer just really got out of hand. And if it weren't for the life support provided by the central banks, you may have seen a reset right away. But actually, you haven't quite seen that. We're sort of in this transitional period, and we have been in it now for 12 years now, is what Blyth would say, where we're not really firmly in this neoliberal era any longer, but we haven't quite made a reset. But what we do have is a whole bunch of voters who are primed to vote for something different. They're primed to vote for populist agents who will wrest control from the current establishment elites that the voters believe have failed them, that they associate with this difficult economy that most voters are living in. Now, common to all incarnations of populism is the idea that nations need to take back control of their economies. Now, one thing that this requires, and this is also common to all contemporary incarnations of what Blyth is going to call populism, or he sometimes calls it global Trumpism. What's common to these incarnations is a drive to place limits on globalization in the economy. Because one of the key thoughts is that a globalized economy, global markets, particularly global capital markets like we described last time, are ones that are difficult for any one nation to govern or to control or to regulate. To the extent to which markets are global and companies can move around in this global environment, it's very hard for any country in particular to regulate that economy. Now, So populism is characterized by these two main things: this sentiment that control needs to be wrested from the establishment, who's no longer responsive to the needs of the population, to the public at large, and then the contemporary incarnation of populism is they're all associated with need to back off on the globalization of markets, of capitalist markets. Those are two key elements of global Trumpisms, or of the kind of populisms that you're seeing pop up all over the world. Now, Blyth points out, however, that populism, the kind that he's thinking about, the kind that's characteristic of the current day, comes in two forms: a left-wing variety and a right-wing variety. The left-wing variety is manifested by the increasing power of green parties throughout Europe. Syriza in Greece. We have Podemos in Spain. New Labour in Britain until recently, where things kind of fell apart for New Labour. Not sure where that's going to go. And in the United States, even though Sanders doesn't look like he's going to get the nomination, there's now a very powerful left wing of the Democratic Party associated with AOC, Warren, and Sanders. AOC is always a tough one. Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, that's my attempt at saying her name. So there's a wing associated with those folks, and that looks to be something that is very different than the kind of center-left Democrats you had, say the Clinton Democrats that you had back in the 90s. Okay. Now on the right, one thing I would mention is that interestingly, while I'm going to make a little aside about Canada again, Canada is kind of hard to place in this scheme. One interesting thing, remember we said this thing about Doug Ford, is he a trumpet on the right? It's not clear, maybe he is. There doesn't really seem to be a clear Sanders-type figure or AOC-type figure or Warren-type figure on the left in Canada. That's an interesting question. All right, setting that to the side. So we've got this left-wing version of populism. We've got this right-wing version of populism as well, and that's probably the more well-known one. Trump, Boris Johnson, Le Pen in France, Lega Nord in Italy, the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. There are increasingly powerful far-right parties throughout the world. And these are manifestations on the right of these same populist forces that Blyth is trying to describe. Now, one key difference, so there are things that the left and the right populists share. They're trying to wrest control back from the elites that are perceived to have failed the population. They're interested and oriented away from globalization. But there's some key differences as well. So the right-wing manifestations, they tend to want to wrest back control from the current elites but in service of like some new hierarchy. So it's alternative for Deutschland or America first, where the idea is that there's a particular set of folks that, from the perspective of these parties, they need to be at the top of this pyramid, and we want to recreate a kind of hierarchical structure just for a different set of people, maybe a broader set of people, but a set of people that might be defined by race or ethnic lines or national lines. So the idea is that this populism wants to seize back control from the elites in service of this interests of this exclusive group at the top of the hierarchy. Now, the left-wing version wants to seize back control from these elites that are perceived to fail the population at large, but the focus is on a kind of egalitarian value. The focus is on trying to distribute, to inclusively address the needs of folks throughout the economy. Okay. So one way to put it is the left wings are trying to seize back control for the entirety of the demos. The right wing is trying to seize control for some privileged subset of the demos. Okay, now at this point, I'm hoping that I can bring the discussion of today's lecture, this movement to populism, and the discussion from the last two lectures back. I can pull this all back to our course themes. Let me begin with a bit of a preview of the readings from May 7th, the Hierarchy in the Forest readings from Bain. So in Hierarchy in the Forest, Bain makes use of a spectrum measurement of species behavior, originally developed by Sandra Verenkamp in her studies of various bird species. This measure sets at one extreme despotic species of animals, and at the other extreme, highly egalitarian species of animals. Now, Bain applies Verenkamp's spectrum to the study of primates, including humans. Now, the focus of this course includes the despotic, what we're looking at, what we're taking, firmly into our field of vision in this course, is this idea that humans have two countervailing tendencies that are in a kind of tension with one another. We have this disposition to form despotic or relations with others, relations of domination with others. But we also have this countervailing disposition to enter into egalitarian forms of relations. We are a malleable species, and we can take this. We can realize institutions and relationships that forefront one or the other of these two possible dispositions for humans. Now, one of Bain's conclusions is that humans have a disposition to dominate, but they can all be organized in different ways. Some that bring out and institutionalize domination relationships, and others that constrain this tendency and give room to the human countervailing tendency to relate in more egalitarian ways. Now, we can co-opt the same spectrum measurement for current purposes. That is, we can consider Blyth's two computers. Remember, we've got this neoliberal computer from 1980 to 2008, and we have this 1945 to 1980 Great Compression computer. Now, I think we could argue that the Great Compression computer creates a political economy, a large set of relationships amongst people that falls closer to the egalitarian extreme of Verenkamp's spectrum. And the neoliberal computer, with its heightened inequalities, the bailouts for the 1%, and the seeming disinterest in the plight of 80 or 90% of folks in the economy, that looks like something that looks like more of a dominating relationship, something that is a political economy that services the interests of some at the expense of the interests of a whole bunch of others, as opposed to taking the interests of folks roughly equally into account. So the idea is that the neoliberal area, we would locate it closer to the despotic extreme of Verenkamp's spectrum, and the Great Compression era, we locate closer to the egalitarian extreme. Now, So we can apply Vanderkamp spectrum to those two periods, but we can also apply it to left-wing and right-wing populism, or we can apply it to thinking about this prospective reset of the system that we're kind of working our way towards. Blyth's idea is that the era of neoliberalism is over. We're shopping for a new computer. What kind are we going to buy? Are we going to buy one or design one that will fall closer to this egalitarian extreme, maybe even do better than the Great Compression did? Or are we going to create a new design of the political economy that places us closer to the despotic regime? I think a useful way of thinking about it is that the right-wing populists want to do something that we would locate closer to this despotic extreme of the spectrum. And the left-wing populists want to do something that places closer to this egalitarian extreme of the spectrum. The course is going to be about different institutional designs that may locate us in different places on the spectrum. It's also going to be about the spectrum, whether that's like an appropriate and cogent and coherent way to think about humans, both as a matter of empirical fact about about human nature, and also a lot of the course is going to talk about the values of solidarity, egalitarian relationship, consider whether those things really are valuable, and also consider the opposing disvalues of domination relationships and trying to understand that a bit better. Okay, thank you very much. That concludes my series of lectures for Assignment 1. You'll be hearing from me next with a series of lectures on Assignment 2, that's Boehm's Hierarchy in the Forest, which we've already previewed a bit here in this lecture. Thanks a lot. See you tomorrow in the discussion sections.